Kick-ass facts, pew pew pew, the last in our series of shit they believed about women. Discouraged from traveling alone, particularly long distances, as it was believed their bodies couldn't handle the physical strain. Travel was seen as something only men could do safely, whether for business or exploration. Women who traveled, especially alone, were considered reckless, and there was a belief that the rough condition of the long journey could harm their delicate constitutions. This myth was often invoked to restrict women to the domestic sphere and keep them dependent on male companions for. When cars were first introduced, many argued that women lacked the physical strength, coordination, or mental capacity to drive. As automobiles became more popular in the early 20th century, women who drove were often mocked or considered dangerous drivers. It was believed that women didn't have the same spatial awareness or quick decision-making abilities as men, and that the act of driving was too complex or strenuous for them. This myth was rooted in the broader idea that women were less capable of mastering new technologies or handling responsibility, when really it was because they didn't want their wives to run away. In several cultures, it's believed that women's menstrual blood was impure and dangerous and that it could spoil food, cause crops to fail, or harm men. Menstruation has been surrounded by taboos in many societies. In some, menstruating women were isolated or forbidden from participating in religious, social, or household activities. For example, in some parts of rural Europe and India, people believed that a menstruating woman's touch could spoil food or crops. In certain religious traditions, menstruating women were considered ritually unclean, restricting their participation in religious rites or entering places of worship. These beliefs reinforced the idea that women's bodies were inherently flawed or dangerous. It was widely believed that women were more prone to fainting due to their delicate nature and weak constitution. During the Victorian era, fainting became almost synonymous with femininity. The restrictive corsets worn at the time certainly contributed to women fainting more often, as they limited lung capacity and caused difficulty breathing. However, fainting was also seen as a sign of a woman's fragility, and fainting spells were romanticized in literature and art. This perception reinforced the idea that women were physically weaker and in need of constant protection, while the fainting itself was often the result of societal pressures or physical restrictions imposed on women. It was thought that women were naturally more prone to melancholy, depression, or hysteria due to their biological makeup, particularly linked to the reproductive system. In various periods, women's mental health was often linked to the reproductive system, with conditions like melancholia and hysteria being attributed to their menstrual cycle or their wombs. The notion that women were biologically predisposed to mental illness contributed to a lack of serious medical treatment for conditions like depression and reinforced the stereotype that women were overly emotional or unstable. Treatments were often dismissive or even harmful, such as hysterectomies or forced isolation. In the early to mid 20th century, it was thought that working night shifts would disrupt women's delicate hormonal balances and lead to infertility or other health problems. As women entered the industrial workforces during and after World War II, there was significant concern about them working night shifts, particularly in factories or hospitals. Some argued that night work would cause hormonal imbalances, exhaustion, and damage to women's reproductive systems. This claim helped reinforce societal beliefs that women's primary role was in the home, as mothers and caregivers, rather than as full participants in the workforce. Last, but certainly not least on our list, throughout much of the 20th century, it was commonly believed that women should not perform jobs that involved heavy lifting because their bodies were too fragile and it could damage their reproductive organs. This belief was used to justify excluding women from many manual labor roles, especially in fields like construction, agriculture, and factory work. The argument was that lifting heavy objects or performing strenuous physical tasks would harm their ability to bear children or cause permanent injury. These myths ignored the fact that many women, particularly in rural areas, had been performing physically demanding work for centuries without such problems. This notion served to keep women out of better paying jobs and roles seen as traditionally male.